Okay, so welcome everybody coming into the cafe. Welcome. This will be the last EOcafe of the year. Unfortunately, we've done the Christmas EOcafes in the past, the Christmas specials, but we won't do one this year. Because it felt a little bit tired last year as a formula. And also it's got too close to Christmas, so it would be the 22nd, so people are already away or think of being away. So this will be the last EOcafe of the year, but we do plan to be back next year, and who knows, if we're still going, we'll perhaps have a Christmas special next year. So normal rules, just a reminder of the rules for the EOcafe. If you can keep your microphones off, unless I specifically ask you to join in. You can, but please feel free to leave your cameras on. It's always good to see people. And if you've got a question, then put it into the chat. And if we have the time or the direction, then we will. I'll ask you to put the question yourself. So it's nice to have it in your own words. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome Simon Kay. Simon is Deputy Head of Unit in DG Klima at the European Commission, and we're talking about carbon removals and a new proposal. But before we get on to the core of the topic, I always like to just ask our guests to introduce themselves and say a bit about, so that you know them a little bit better. Simon, welcome, and just say a few words about yourself.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff, and also to Delphine, who's going to be in the background there helping me out with some slides. So Simon Kay. I've been working nearly 3 decades now for the European Commission, but before that I was, in fact, did my studies in geography and then specialized postgrad in remote sensing. So in fact, I've done a lot of work in remote sensing and geodata in particular. And I think I definitely will have been to some ESAC meetings before, because up until the time when I swapped to climate, I was working on agriculture policy a lot, and a lot to do with the remote sensing side on agriculture policy. So 12, 13 years ago, in fact, I was acting head of unit for the Mars project. So I think many of you will know the Monitoring Agriculture with the Remote Sensing project. And I was able to run the team there on the different types of remote sensing work they were doing. But a decade ago, I swapped to DG Klima, to DG Climate Action, to give it its full name, where we basically established the policy, the broad policy for all aspects of the economy for climate, and have been working progressively over the last decade on the part related to land, or land use and land use change in particular. And that's also where I've been trying to make sure that we bring in, because we really think it's very important, things related to remote sensing. So I've been very lucky to have had 3 decades of professional connection with what I started off back in the early 90s, and it's really nice to be back into the remote sensing community a bit now, after nearly 10 years deep into climate legislation.
You're a member of a very selective club, Simon, that a policy person, a policy expert who also knows about remote sensing. That's
there are a few of us, but
there
not
are
too
very
many.
few of you.
There's a couple of us.
Yeah, so it's good, and thank you for joining us today, and I'm sure we're going to have interesting discussion. So the background for today, or the theme for today, is around the proposal to establish a new regulation on carbon removal. And carbon removal sounds sort of a big topic, so hopefully you can help us understand a bit more what that means and what Earth observation can do. I think the idea is that there will be new rules on certification of carbon removals, of encouraging carbon removals through renewable energies and less carbon in the energy cycle, but also then to not just to reduce the carbon emissions, but also to capture and store and introduce measures to help with that. So this is really quite innovative, I think, and quite exciting area. So maybe let's launch straight in, and you tell us more about it, the background, and how it's coming about.
Okay. So I've got 2 or 3 slides just to give a bit of a context. So Delphine perhaps can start with the first one. Yeah, why carbon removals? We might even say what are carbon removals, just
Yes.
because it may be not obvious to everybody what this is about. And I guess everybody understands what emissions are. So greenhouse gas emissions, they're not only carbon dioxide, there are also other gases. The ones most related to the land are methane and nitrous oxide. Won't bother going into too much detail. But on this graph, that's the orange part. And this graph is showing the progress of the European Union since 1990 through the 20s, as we are now, and through to 2050. And I think the important thing here is the realization 3-4 years ago, also by the IPCC, that it really wasn't going to be very feasible to get down to eliminating all emissions from society, from industry, from the economy, in time to be able to maintain the ambitions of really preventing global warming happening to the degree that is considered to be relatively safe. So this is the famous 1.5 degrees. And about 3-4 years ago, we basically took on board that scientific advice published by the IPCC, discussed by modelers, that there would be a need to basically balance the emissions with the antonym of that, the opposite of that, which is the removals. And that's the green part under the graphic. And you can see that we've always had some removals in the EU. We've always had a certain amount of absorption of carbon dioxide. It's important to note it's only carbon dioxide that's absorbed. And the aim of the policy framework that's been set up is that by 2050, the green part should balance the orange part. So the blue line there moves from 100 down to 0. And so that's where the sort of net zero idea comes from. The minus 55 ambition that we have for 2030, for example, at the moment also is minus 55 compared to the 100 on the left. So the key point here is that removals are absolutely an enormous part of the overall plan to get to 2050, and that we actually need to increase the amount of removals. We need to probably double them in order to get to this balance. Otherwise, we're going to have to reduce the emissions even more. And it's already, as you can see, the case that they'll have to be reduced by about 90% compared to 1990. So maybe onto the next slide. So what do we have in terms of political context? The EU has a climate law passed in 2021, which basically states that we need to achieve this climate neutrality by 2050 and sets out a role for the Commission to propose intermediate targets for basically 2030 and 2040. And one of these intermediate targets is that for land use change and forestry. And there is a target that can be expressed in absolute terms, 310 megatons by 2030. To give you an idea, today we're at about 260, minus 260. So to get to minus 310 is quite an increase. Also because the trend at the moment is the wrong way. It's not an improvement of that. It's actually a slight decrease. And then what Jeff was mentioning just now is another facet that we, what I should mention is that the LULUCF regulation has just been revised. And earlier in December, we've agreed, the co-legislators have agreed, so Parliament and Council have agreed on the framework and the target of 310. And we've just made a proposal last week about the sustainable carbon cycles, which is a way of factoring in action that is taken by individual actors, either in what we call carbon farming or what we call industrial solutions. And sorry, I'm just opening the chat, which I had open but now disappeared. Don't have the preview anymore, but I think I can see it now. Okay. And I think we'll come back to that maybe with Jeff in more detail to explain what those differences are. One very important thing is that when we're dealing with land, we need to monitor what's going on. And that's where the remote sensing comes in, and we'll discuss that a bit further. Just to answer the questions that came up already, the graph includes methane as well as CO2. Yes, it also includes nitrous oxide, includes F gases. So it's all greenhouse gas. It's not just carbon dioxide. Graph shows the annual balance. We need further to reduce the already released CO2 as well. I think what we're doing here is framing it in terms of the Paris Agreement and what the Paris Agreement asks for, which is to have emissions and removals balanced by 2050. So I think the way to look at the context, if you like, of the EU nationally determined contribution, if you like, in the full term, is in that sense. We're looking to meet the commitment of the European Union to the Paris Agreement. But maybe we can go back to Jeff, and we can start up the conversation in that way.
Just comment.
You can take the slides off if you want for the moment.
Yeah, just to comment on the questions, Simon. We generally come to those
okay.
a bit later.
Yeah.
I try to we perhaps I didn't explain, but we
no problem.
We talk for a bit, and then I'll introduce and let people ask their questions. Okay, so the curves that you're showing, there's no distinction between sort of historic and projection. So the figures sort of to the left of today, are those all real numbers?
Okay.
We're showing something like a 40%, maybe even bigger reduction from 1990 to today. Is that?
Not quite. I think that so the first part of that is actually from the inventories, and up to 2005 is from the inventories, and then this graphic is in fact derived from our modeling. Yeah. But I'm not sure it was a 40% reduction. Shouldn't be quite that big. But the reduction that you will see around 2020 is matching. It's calibrated to it is a modeling going from 2005, but it is calibrated to the inventory now. But I would consider that graphic to be more of a schematic.
Yeah.
It's based actually on something in the communication we made in 2018 on the Clean Planet communication. If you look it up like that, you should find the communication that was made with that graphic in it. Okay. Or maybe it's even the climate target plan, which is from 2020, I think.
Yeah, I think that's mentioned at the bottom, isn't it? So okay, thanks for that. Just one question, because we're always talking about the Green Deal.
Yeah.
So how does this fit with the Green Deal? It's part of the Green Deal, I presume. But just say
exactly.
a few words there.
Yeah. So it's very much part of the Green Deal. I could have put up a slide that we've got a classic slide showing sort of hexagons tessellating with proliferating in all senses. But the Green Deal package that came out in the summer of 21 is made up of about a dozen proposals. And the key climate ones are the emission trading system, the effort sharing regulation, LULUCF, and then the package for CO2 emissions from cars. And then there's a number of ancillary ones in addition to that relating to aircraft. Then there are elements related to emission trading systems for building and transport, maritime sector, which has also just been agreed. There's an F-gas, hydrofluorocarbon piece of legislation revision as well. And these are in fact mostly revisions.
Yeah.
And they're also flanked, the Green Deal is flanked by a number of strategies like farm to fork, the biodiversity strategy, the forestry strategy, which all, if you like, place a vision around how any one of these policies should be viewed. So renewable energy directive is another one in there as well, that helps balance between the use of biomaterials and bioenergy and where we source it from, and so forth.
So I mean, this is it's a proposal at the moment.
Most of them are in the point of being agreed. So LULUCF, for example, has just been confirmed. Obviously the text is changed, and there are some still in the making. But the one related to the carbon removal certification, in particular, the carbon farming and that indeed is a proposal that only came out a week ago. Yes.
So that part, some parts are rather more advanced than others. Then.
Exactly. Yes.
And the I mean obviously everyone gets excited because Copernicus is mentioned in the proposal, in the proposed legislation. I think my view has changed on this very strongly, that there was a time when it was felt that Earth observation was not something to put into the regulations. But what I've seen in a number of areas now is the difficulty that agencies, organizations have, particularly public agencies, in order to get the budgets they need to use Earth observation, even though Earth observation may be a very effective way to do their work. And so they're always pleading, or the message I'm getting is that should be reflected in legislation. So we're seeing quite a lot now, which is coming through, where Copernicus and even Earth observation more generally is mentioned, and I think that's extremely positive. So I mean, in here we've got Copernicus. We've also got commercial Earth observation mentioned. These are all part of the validation process, or foreseen as possible tools to be used in the validation process.
Yes, although we want them to be used upstream as well. And I think here is the major change from maybe even a paradigm shift compared to, for example, the Kyoto Protocol and the international context. So climate policy comes very, very much from an international context. And the discussions that went through to build the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s, and then it was only ratified 7 or 8 years later by, I think, 2005. In this period, I think there was basically it was all about trust between the parties that signed up to the treaty. And therefore, it wasn't really about how to restructure an economy or society. It was about, I'm doing this and I'm going to report you these emissions, and my objective is to change them in this way. And I'm going to, as a country globally, I'm going to express this information in a structured table, and you will believe what I say, or you won't believe what I say, and there will be some kind of auditing of that going on. And what I think we are changing now is that there's a realization that it's not really possible to just have some financial instruments and some direction of travel. You can do that with some of the things like the energy sector, where you've got, you made decisions, right? We're going to build a wind park, or we're going to invest in solar power. But when it comes with land, it's very, very different, because you need to make decisions about what is happening where, and actually see if it's effective in translating on the ground. And so therefore there is a feedback loop that is much, much more important in the policy process. So it's not enough to just have a table every 5 years or even every year in Excel that tells you that your emissions have reduced. You actually need to know, where are the organic soils that we need to be managing, and are we managing them in the right way? And that's where, so there's a verification side, like you say, which is downstream. but we think that there is a policy monitoring side, and so that we actually think that the Earth observation elements are actually of most relevance from the policy monitoring side.
Okay, so informing policy decisions.
Yeah.
And making sure that those, because again, the policies have to be verifiable. So it fits in both camps there. Okay, how well, before coming, I wanted to come on a little bit and sort of say, well, how mature is this? But land use cover change.
Yeah.
You've mentioned it already. It was on your slide, and you've said that there's already legislation very close on that. Tell us a bit more about that, because we're familiar with this as something which EEA does produce maps and charts and figures around this, but this is taking it to a different level, I think.
So indeed, so the EEA is one of our key partners here. Maybe I should also mention that the JRC has also been instrumental in working with the inventory development on LULUCF. But as it becomes a little more operational, we've shifted, in fact, the land part to the EEA, where it fits in with all the other aspects of the inventory, so the transport buildings and so forth. Then indeed the products that are the European products that under the Copernicus program that the EEA produces are helpful for member states who, for example, want to set a baseline, but they're not necessarily the ones that work on the basis of the granularity for time or even resolution. Because what we see in the revision that we've done now is basically a step change where we really need to work on the very granular elements of land management. So as you get into policies and you work on, for example, I don't know, restoring a forest area or restoring an organic soil area, then we actually start to handle the land in a very different way, and the monitoring needs to be much more accelerated from a timeliness perspective. I think it's still a little. So the obvious services that would work for us from Copernicus, for example, would be the ones related to the European land cover. So periodically, there would be CLC plus or something of that, but definitely CLC plus. But we also need to have annual monitoring, and then the other kinds of services that can be produced from, even if they're relatively rough and ready, if they can help us guide where we're acting, then they can be very, very, I think, influential and even instrumental in setting up policies. So we definitely foresee the EEA to be heavily involved, and we have in the work program that's linked to the LULUCF regulation, there is a strong element for the EEA to be involved and for them to work also with member state partners and contracting partners. And then we have another part of work which is more research oriented, I think, where we're looking more at how can we take the scientific results that we have today with remote sensing and apply them to, for example, estimate emissions from soils or from woodland, and enhance the way that we do the estimates. So just to close off this part, or at least my response, it's important to note we're not monitoring in this sense, we're not monitoring the actual gas flux, we're monitoring the surrogate, which is the land use cover, the land cover or land use, and the land use change. And from that, we infer, knowing the geographical context of where we are, the type of soil, the drainage, the history of the management of that land parcel, then we can come up with a better estimate of the flux of the gas, either being emitted or being absorbed into the soil or the biomass on that site.
That sounds a bit like Destination Earth. Is that part of the picture that you're working to, or is that sort of a bit far away for the moment.
I would see that as more kind of a kind of a twin for, I mean, if a member state decides that it needs to set up a digital twin that it's going to actually use for its policy making decision, that would be fine. But I think we are also, we already need to have data for 21. I mean, fortunately, Sentinel, so they're collecting data, and there will be other member states campaigns, whether they're airborne, LiDAR, whatever. There will be tons of data that can be utilized, and it will be case by case, member state by member state, region by region, to work out what is the best combination. But yeah, we can't wait until we've got the perfect. I'm not saying that's what which is the Connect program, I think, but it's more that I would see more as a kind of digital twin impact of then trying to decide how do I structure an integrated policy framework. And here we have to really get going already now with what we've got available.
Yeah. Okay. So that might be relevant in well, 10 years time, but
for example, yeah.
Okay. What is it about the land cover mapping? You've mentioned granularity, you've mentioned timeliness, you've mentioned 1 year as being sort of a possible rhythm for measurement. I wasn't sure if by timeliness you meant sort of delay to having the information or the regularity of the information. What are the improvements there you're looking for?
Okay, so
what should people be thinking about is what I'm
right.
sort of headed for.
So with land, there has been a convention that basically one looks at the let's say the response or the estimates, because in general in greenhouse gas inventories it is pretty much all estimates from one model or another. So I noticed that somebody's commented that they're super complex to model greenhouse gas cycles. It's also quite complex to model industrial emissions as well. And I think it's only a question of the experience that we've had. Well, there's a lot to go into it. Absolutely, they're complex. But the UNFCCC, so United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, expects us to report each year with annual data sets. Now, are those annual data sets based on annual measurements? Certainly not at the moment. And they're usually based on measurements that are made periodically. And is that, and a classic case is forest inventories that take place on the ground, where there's a revisit to the plot maybe every 5 or 10 years, something like that. So there are statistics which are produced that have an annual significance, but they're not necessarily annual measurements or annually collected. And this is the first point that I think that with remote sensing, we have really an opportunity to beef up and enrich the data sets that we already collect. So there's no question of saying that we stop collecting the data we collect. We definitely have to continue to try to enhance the monitoring. And in particular, the difficulty with this periodic averaging is that if you use that for target compliance, for example, then you wait maybe 5 years, or in the second commitment to the Kyoto Protocol, which is from 2013 to 2020, it's 8 years. And if you wait till the end and then discover that you missed your target, then there's not much you can do about it because it's a little bit too late. So in that sense, to have the policy succeed, we need to look carefully at what's going on during this period, even if for compliance, legal binding targets or whatever, there's a different way of making that compliance action happen. We need to get timely data during the period that allows us to fine tune the policies and adjust what we're doing on the way. And that is really where I think we have to look. I mean, everybody has always, in my experience of remote sensing, always talked about spatial resolution, ground sampling distance, and so forth. Actually, we're at the point today where we have unbelievable, for someone who was doing his PhD in the late 80s, unbelievable. Well, Landsat, I mean, think of AVHRR or something. I mean, unbelievable spatial resolution combined with fantastic temporal resolution. So we are able to collect really, really rich data sets that help us understand the phenology of forests, of agriculture systems, to see whether, for example, soil has been exposed, whether forests are being clear-cut, whether there is storm damage, whether there's pest damage, a whole series of different things that can be used to help us guide what is happening to this very important system that is only going to become more important as we move towards the 2050 target. And so I think we can definitely use the data sets we have today to help us make this step towards collecting some of these data annually.
Yeah. Well, you have to start somewhere, and
yeah,
you need to take whatever data you can get, and then move on from there. I mean, I guess there's quite a lot of research required around this as well, and I presume that there are research activities either ongoing or foreseen to which are linked.
So we have a number of different. The main ones that we're working on is perhaps not so much on the things like the land cover and the land use change issues. I think these are we think that there's a fairly good set of tools out there that can be used. I think what is the area where we still need to refine things, and we've given ourselves a few years in the legislation to do that, is how we use the data that are collected to feed into the more sophisticated modeling. Maybe that a little mention on that. So the IPCC basically categorizes the way that estimates are done in two ways. The first are I'm being very simplistic. You take a number from a table, so-called emission factor, could be a removal factor, but you take a number from a table that says that this kind of land use in this temperate zone with this kind of rainfall, you can expect to see X number of tons per year per hectare being sequestered or emitted. And then that's a so-called tier 1, tier 2. Tier 2 would be a little bit more refined based on more local empirical data. And then there is the so-called tier 3 modeling, where basically you have certain non-parametric models which are defined to take inputs like temperature, like wind, like rainfall, like soil type, like crop use, and so forth. And these would be used to then give a more dynamic modeling environment where there would be, even in an agricultural context, for example, quite parcel specific potential, or maybe regional specific potential for emissions and removals. And some of those, particularly the tier 3, I think are very good candidates for using remote sensing data, because we need to know what kind of crops are where, and where are they located, so we can assess whether they're on this soil type, this drained area. Have they been in a field which has been arable crop for the last 20 years, or is it part of a rotation system? Does it have a cover crop during the winter? Is it maybe grassland, but what sort of grassland? And I think there is still indeed a lot of potential for some applied research to develop, particularly in the different geographical contexts of the European Union.
You're certainly highlighting how complex the task is, I think.
Yeah, it is. It is complex, but I think there are tools out there that we can use.
Yeah, and tools which can be further developed. I'm absolutely sure. So, I mean, Tobias Langenke has put a comment into the chat. Tobias is from the EEA. Tobias, do you want to come in and comment? Join us in the discussion.
Maybe just very briefly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, here you are.
Just very briefly, that so we are working on some aspects of what Simon has mentioned, and obviously in close cooperation with DG Klima as well. In particular, we are looking at a use of data from the Copernicus Land Monitoring Service to support us at EEA in looking at the reported data from the countries and having some sort of independent data sets that can at least confirm or question some parts of the submissions, but that is still under development, and we need to be very careful with this, given the political sensitivities also on countryside. And we're also developing tools that the countries can themselves possibly use with CLC Plus Core, a database where they can combine existing data and potentially actually help them with their own monitoring and reporting. So overall, we are quite happy that this new regulation has such strong ambitions to move countries to a more geospatially explicit approach, and that will largely or partly based on remote sensing data, and therefore is sort of a lot of opportunities for this community here.
Yeah, which of course is where the strong interest comes. Okay, stay and comment as you as you wish. Dietrich, I don't know whether you want to develop your question further, or whether it's a statement that Simon has already commented on. Dietrich?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think it is really super complex, and I mean, we have to do something, and we have to use remote sensing because it's a fantastic data which covers the whole globe. But I mean, if you look into forests and then into the soil under the forest, we have to be honest enough to say there are things which cannot be detected as well with remote sensing. And modeling, of course, you can always try to model a lot of things, and you can use additional data like climate data and soil data, but very often it is the case that you have different resolutions and different sources, and perhaps there were some changes in the past and so on. So it makes the things not always easier, you know. I was just talking to a farmer in Germany who told me that he got data which came from a university and from an enterprise which is working since decades in this field, and they were modeling his yield, and the result was for him very disappointing because they were 60% away from the truth. And that is something which makes me a bit concerned. I mean, we can say, okay, we can do it. Yeah, there is a way to do it, but we have to be very careful, because otherwise our figures go in one or the other direction and has nothing to do with the reality. And the other thing which I was having in mind when you were saying, I mean, it depends very much on the system we are observing, this ecosystem we are observing. And there I always wonder, if you look at the forest, for example, we look at the forest like in the center of Europe, in the Black Forest, where we have in the Black Forest mainly fir and spruce. And then we have the situation that due to climate change, more and more of the spruce trees are dying away. Now, how do we balance it? Do we say, okay, half of it is already gone, it's now gone, and now something else is growing? What happens with the timber? Is it now sequestered carbon because it's still lying on the field, or we took it away to make construction wood out of it, or is it adding to the greenhouse gas because it was burned in an oven? I mean, those are all things, you know. Yeah.
You'll be happy to know we've thought of that.
Yeah.
But maybe to come in on, so maybe that if I describe what you're just saying, or your comment, it's a bit glass half empty, but I would see the glass very much half full. And I would also say, without going into the details, I agree absolutely that monitoring forests with remote sensing presents a lot of challenges, of course, because you can't always get through the crown. You can't see the understory, let alone the soil. And even estimates of biomass from remote sensing would be very difficult. But let's consider that if our alternative is only to go periodically to an airframe sample of maybe spread by 5 by 5 kilometers, or in some member states even 8 by 8 kilometers, and even some member states don't even have this, then you would be even more worried about the quality of the estimates that come out of it. And so we're absolutely conscious of this, and I want to plead absolutely that there is no question of going ahead with just one or other of these kinds of data sources. They need to work symbiotically together. and therefore we will enhance what we have. Yeah, we're not going to pick up the below ground carbon pool through below ground biomass carbon pool from satellites, at least certainly not those that work in the visible spectrum, and even probably not even at the radar. But that's got to be collected, presumably with in-field survey that will complement, and then via the sampling framework, we'll come up with estimates that hopefully will be improved. To come on to your point about what do we do, I think where remote sensing provides us with a very, very synoptic opportunity is monitoring for things like bark beetle infestation, drought issues in forest, dieback, increased mortality. These estimates are much more timely when they're made from remote sensing than they would be from the area frame sample of a national forest inventory. And we can already start to act, understand the processes behind it. Perhaps it's not going to be easy, particularly in forestry, which has a long time cycle for its management to actually intervene. But then also the estimates of the emissions from the embodied carbon in the timber. So rest assured that the way that LULUCF functions is that as soon as you have an extraction of wood from the forest, it's considered to be emitted, it's calculated as emitted to the atmosphere. So it doesn't even have to be burnt yet. It's automatically calculated as being emitted to the atmosphere. And then if it is used for a product, and this is one of the things that under the carbon farming we consider is also can be beneficial. If it's used as a product, it can be a kind of delayed emission. So Jeff's shelves, which look perhaps as if they're made of wood behind him, I'm not sure they're real shelves,
sure.
but yeah,
There's some wood in there, I think.
Yeah. They basically can capture carbon that is then a delayed release. So that is an important aspect. So it's a very complicated question. Also, by the way, if wood is left in the forest as dead wood, this is also a carbon pool that is included and accounted under LULUCF. And there is actually an encouragement for member states to leave dead wood in the forest for biodiversity. So there are lots of nuances that we're not going to have time to touch upon. But certainly in LULUCF, it's been thought about for quite a long time and how to deal with that. So remote sensing has a complementary role to play on data. It definitely is going to help us with the monitoring of these phenomena, like the infestations, but also drought in crops and yields and so forth. But Jeff, maybe we can move to the on the carbon credits.
Yeah, Nikos Spiropoulos. Nikos?
Yeah, hello. I'm just from Vancouver and from Canada as an observer. We just want to ask this kind of question, as we are investing in this part of the game, and we are working with the Royal Bank of Canada to see if we can create, a body where we can certify the Earth observation as a key element for the calculation of credits. So the question is if something happens in Europe, or, if there are the big four companies like Ernst & Young or Grant Thornton or whatever, involved in that kind of, touching the base of this, huge opportunity in business. I mean, it's environment, of course, but also it's a lot of business behind. Yeah. Thank you for this.
On the carbon credit side, so that's the proposal that came out last week. There is indeed, as you mentioned, a huge business interest. Most of the interest that we are in contact with really comes from, and the most interesting part, as far as we think it fits into policy, is from agribusiness and let's say the bioeconomy processing sector. So in terms of, for example, I don't know, just an energy company offsetting emissions, that's not really where we want the policy to function. We wanted to focus on removals, on enhancing removals, and we want to try to leverage the very strong enthusiasm at the moment from the bioeconomy processing sector industry to do that. Now, why are they interested in doing it? It's because if you have a product, imagine you produce a loaf of bread or you produce a bottle of beer, and you want to say that this product is carbon neutral, climate neutral, then you look at all what we call the scope 1 and scope 2, the emissions that take place in your industry, the energy you use in your factories, the transport of the product onto the shelf of the supermarket and so forth. But then you have to look further back. Where does the grain that is used to produce the bread come from? And then you start to look at the farms that are involved, and the many of these larger organizations have realized that they have a potential, even a responsibility, to actually go back to those farms and say, what can we do here to improve your emissions profile and maybe even make it emissions negative? And there comes the key point of how do you actually make sure that we don't get into the example that Dietrich just gave of an estimate of yields being 60% wrong or something. And so our proposal from last week really focuses on the standardization of the certification process and trying to raise the game to a level where there is a credible certification methodology worked out, and that can be applied. And in our EU-centric view, sorry if you're in Canada, but that's the way it is when we pass EU legislation, that we want it to be that action by a farmer in Spain could be used by a processing industry in the Netherlands. I mean, we also think that many of these corporate entities that we are working with or dealing with or discussing with, they're not located only in one little region. They are, you might have seen last week that Ahold Delhaize, which is actually a large supermarket chain based in the Netherlands and Belgium, with, by the way, a lot of influence, a lot of outlets on the East Coast of the US as well, and globally, that they place this kind of philosophy into their corporate vision. But they need to know that when they have, I don't know, frozen potato fries in the freezer, that these are, what are the emissions associated with those fries, or can they actually work with the farm where that comes, or the farms where those potatoes come from, to reduce those emissions? So you need a methodology for calculating those emissions that is robust, that is practical, that is not going to be overly expensive. And you need to know the baseline that you're starting from, which means basically you need to measure what's going on now. And that's often the land management taking place in the years, recent history, let's say a decade. There's nothing in the proposal on that particular front, but this will be in the methods. And that is then monitored, because the farm will have agreed with the downstream user of the farm products, I'll do this for you, yes, and we make a contract. So that contract might explicitly talk about a reimbursement per ton of CO2 captured. It might just relate to the action taken on the farm, but there would be a calculation that would then go through a certificate produced by a certifying intermediary that will be supervised by an authority in a member state, that will follow a standardized procedure that would be recognized by other member states. And of course, what we would hope is that that approach can be taken on and utilized by elsewhere. I mean, maybe there would be an influence that there would be research done in Canada that would be also useful for similar agro-systems in the EU, and vice versa. And so therefore there could even, that's a long way away, but recognition of the way that these standards are established in different places. But again, remote sensing and monitoring of what's going on is one of the key layers in this whole process going forward. And here I think it's going beyond your kind of, it could be related to a Copernicus service, but it could also be much more bespoke, could be much more related to individual companies with remote sensing expertise, providing that as intermediate providers to the certification bodies, which will also themselves be commercial entities.
So Nikos, are there plans, or is similar things being talked about in Canada?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I mean, I don't want to waste your time, but we're just investing, you know, and talking to some entities where I can disclose to you, you know, they want to have this kind of daily, you know, how can say, temporal consistent coverage, you know, with certain, you know, spectral resolution. So there are some initiatives that are taking place, and the big, how can say, players like the Royal Bank of Canada, they want to be involved in this.
Yeah.
And play some game. I don't know. I mean, and this is something, but we can disclose more in another session. You know, there are I mean, this discussion is an endless. It's so interesting, you know, and I think you need another or two, you know, two EOcafe, how can say, sessions to cover that. But I'm very happy to share everything. Yeah, Geoff, with your team as well. You know, it's something very interesting, and we are facing this kind of interest from let's say from North America, Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's we can certainly stay in touch on that. Good to see Anna here. Anna, you make a comment in your in the chat.
Hi.
Do you want to expand on that? I don't know. It's an interesting comment.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Good to see you all. Yes, my comment was a bit different. I was talking about carbon offset projects, and I have seen already a couple of articles or papers explaining that those projects often claim emission reductions that, when the scientific team goes and checks with Earth observation with satellite data, if those are real, in fact, they are not real. So, and something this article I mentioned in California was very, I mean, it really drew my attention, because it more or less said that after 10 or more years of carbon reduction programs and a lot of credits issued, the reality is that there hasn't been any change in the carbon reduction from the business as usual line, right? So yeah, and so I've been in several fora where they discuss also what's going on here, and they say it's due to the lack of standards, the lack of I don't know, the certifiers, the verification and validation bodies not having access to the raw data so that they can rerun the model. The lack of also standards in the models, not only in the verification side, but also in the modeling of the biomass. So yeah, I see another comment here by Tatiana saying that there are no robust soil models and MRV tools. So I think that the same happens with above ground biomass. So there is the need also for sound above ground biomass models to derive the carbon estimations. And in the meantime, well, with all these business boom, and I mean, you mentioned energy companies wanted to offset, but not doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can be that, of course, and greenwashing is happening, but it could be also a country wanting to distribute the benefits of the forest among communities and local investors. So and there are European operators there working in those carbon offsetting projects, and there's need for more. I don't know if this is part of this regulation or not. But
do you want to make a quick comment, Simon, before asking Titania to develop her point?
Well, maybe you can already, because I think it's Titania's point that I'm kind of going to answer.
It's very close, yeah.
Which is that if there are no robust soil carbon models, we already report since nearly 2 decades to UNFCCC. Using what? Okay, using soil carbon models. So the best we can do now is work with what we have and improve the quality of the inputs we have and improve the quality of those estimates. So I understand that maybe in the context of a carbon removals program, that might be, you might consider that there is an issue there. But that's also why there is not an incorporation today of the certificates into, for example, the 2030 targets of the member states. Yes, we want to work on a process to get there, and the proposal is a framework of how to establish the methods to get there, to avoid exactly what you're describing in California. So in California, I'm not an expert on the Californian scheme, and I also have seen the reports that were in the press recently about that. But the issue there is also about how the program is established and run. And so we definitely want to establish our program on the basis of the quality of the removals is paramount. Otherwise, first of all, it would just be greenwashing. And secondly, it won't lead to a market that would work. Because if there was no need for investors if basically the value of what was being produced was dubious, etc., then we end up with the problem that we have today, essentially, of the voluntary carbon market, which is that nobody knows exactly which standard. I mean, you have different companies with different qualities of standards, with different approaches. How, as a buyer of those, you can work perhaps directly with the certifiers to try to make it more robust, but they themselves, I think, also would prefer to work in a framework where they can show, yes, here we are in the standardized framework. That's the message that we've been getting. And to avoid that, we would have a situation where 10 years down the line, there's been no mitigation. That's absolutely something that we need to avoid. We don't have time to not have mitigation. We need to, in 10 years' time, have a lot of extra mitigation. So, yeah, we're well aware of those issues, and we've had a lot of dialogue with the certifying companies in the voluntary carbon market, and we look to try to take the best that can be taken from those today, learn the lessons of the past, and make sure we have the MRV tools to make sure that we really are able to spot what's going on before 10 years.
Okay.
Thank you, Simon.
I want to give Titania the opportunity to develop a question. Titania, please.
Hello, good evening. My name is Tatiana Boussange. I'm from eAgronom. We are doing carbon programs for farmers already for 2 years.
Right.
So we have practical experience with it. Basically, we're one of those startup companies that are that have the MRV platform. We basically also work on the VM42 methodology or standard from Vera, which is a tough job actually, because you really need to provide a lot of data and to be very robust, and you cannot overpromise on sequestration levels, meaning carbon removal levels per hectare. And that's where I would like to point out the difference between certified credits and I mean, one thing is a carbon credit and the other one is a carbon certificate. A carbon credit is anything that comes through gold standards or Vera, and a certificate is anything that is following an ISO standard or some kind of self-certified approach. We basically are facing some difficulties with the soil model, basically, because whenever we want to develop something in-house, it's extremely costly. We have a lot of Central European countries that are small, and every country needs a localization, a regionalization of the model, and that requires a lot of data. And this is very hard to get. And if you want to get them, that means a lot of trials or collaborations with universities. It takes, again, a lot of time. So that's, I see as one of the biggest benefits that the CRCF could bring is really work on the soil model for the EU, to have the localization, I mean, the data available, and to have to recommend on a soil model that is robust and well, not over promising, but not under promising either, because then the farmers are not motivated, obviously.
Okay, so on the in the legislation, so first of all, on soil models and work that so there is a call every year under the Life Plus program, and a large part of it is dedicated towards climate. And in fact, in the past, we've developed, it's not us, we funded the development of work on organic soil, particularly around the Baltic states, but I think even going into northern Germany and Finland. And we also had a big program, a so-called preparatory project, working on mineral soils in the Mediterranean, which covered 4 or 5 countries for sure. So we definitely have been doing it. We can there's still possibilities to do it. Of course, for the EU to provide funding, it is always through one or other of these programs. I would favor the Life Plus program over the Horizon Europe one, because Horizon Europe is a bit more fundamental research and a bit longer term. However, under Life Plus, there's usually a quite significant co-financing element, although that can be also funded, for example, by member state can add in the funding. Then there is a big push for member states to actually start really getting to grips with this, because there is an obligation in the recently revised regulation that by the 2026 emission year, so this is the one reported in 28, that all member states would have, for all carbon pools, so the soil carbon pools, so-called tier 2, the localized empirical values for emission factors, and that on certain specific biodiverse, mostly biodiverse type sites, that they would work on tier 3. And that's by 2030 reporting. So it gives us, let's say, 4 or 5 years to get things in place. And we see the same time frame also for this carbon removal certification process, where we are going to start discussing with an expert group. I think perhaps some of you might have heard we were setting up an expert group. It has now, we had a huge oversubscription for it. But we will be establishing that in January, February, the first meeting, get it going. And then we have subgroups in there that deal with, for example, soil modeling. And we will look and see what gaps we have, what tools we have. And hopefully that will allow us to get a better stock take of what's going on. But we have been funding in the past. The projects that have existed, I agree that it's probably not so obvious how to find it and which ones are the right ones and which ones are the good ones and which ones need more work. And that's a note that I will take away to try to see if we can find a better way of, let's say, centralizing that information so that companies like your own, which we're very, very interested to have startups working on this. And I know it must be difficult to get going, but we hope to provide a pathway for companies like yours to be operating. I'm not sure I've answered all 3 of your points, but
well, I think it's sort of developing the point through the three paragraphs was the way I read that.
Yeah.
Thanks to Tanya. And maybe that's, I mean, we need to draw to a close now. But that could be also something that we could come back to in a future discussion around this as the legislation becomes more robust, and we can come back to the topic, and maybe we bring Nikos in as well from an international perspective. I wanted to ask about international development on this, and I also wanted to ask about the sort of level of support from member states on this. You know, whether the expectation is that this will fly through, or whether there are difficulties that are still to be resolved. Maybe a very quick comment, but otherwise then I think we'll close off.
So I think there is definitely it would be wrong to say there was a consensus. But in that respect, it's important to note that climate legislation, like environmental legislation, doesn't need a consensus vote, unanimity in the European Council. It's done by qualified majority, so which is still quite a high level. It's
Yeah.
not, and there we see we will actually likely have the vote on the LULUCF proposal next week. At least that's what I'm kind of hoping, that there will be discussion in a council sometime next week, and probably we get a vote there. And I would expect to see the proposal accepted, because there is a strong recognition by member states that if there isn't an improvement in the removals, there's going to be more work on the emission reductions. So that alone is an important component. Then with respect to how to do it on land, it depends where you are. So some member states are much more oriented towards forest, others are more oriented towards soils, others are more oriented towards wetland management. And that's why we have to have a relatively flexible and open way of doing things and give different tools.
Yeah.
So yes, everybody considers it's going to be a challenge. There's been a lot of concern. Do we have all the tools? Do we have time to put them in place? But there is a bit I didn't mention, is that there is a component in the legislation that does offer that the Commission can help and work with member states to try to overcome the technical, let's say, road bumps that come along the way. And then we have, of course, as Tobias intervened, but we have in the EEA a lot of interaction with member states through their different forums that they run with member states to pull together expertise. And again, we have the JRC, which I hope will also provide a scientific forum as well for discussion on all things remote sensing, and even down to the emission factor modeling and so forth. So yes, everybody's a little bit, let's say, we know it's going to be tough, but I think everybody is committed to the fact that we need to get there. Yeah.
Hopefully it will be a good Christmas and New Year then.
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you everyone for joining us. And as we've said, it could well be a subject that we come back to in the not so distant future. As I mentioned earlier, this is the last EOcafe of the year. So I wish you a Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year, and look forward to seeing you next year. At this point, we normally just say, okay, if anyone wants to say anything, we throw the microphones open and you can just come in. We stop the recording at this point as well. So if anybody wishes to carry on the discussion or say anything that they think is relevant, then please just do so. And Simon, just a quick last word to you, if you have anything further that you want to throw in, or maybe I don't know, you were talking about leaving at 5 o'clock, so
yeah, I think
stay on.
I think the DG Klima event is turning into more of a social one next door, so I might have to
okay, we're keeping
around.
you from the beer then.
Yeah. But just say thanks so much, and I think we're looking forward a lot to picking up the threads with not just the remote sensing community, but also the SMEs who are involved in it. We think that it's absolutely crucial that not just the big Copernicus program is there, but also all the companies that have, in my experience in the past, worked with us on, for example, on agriculture, but I guess on environmental monitoring as well, that these are going to be crucial partners for the member states themselves to fulfill the obligations that they've agreed to in the legislation, and also for the certification that we will develop over the next 2, 3, 4 years. And hopefully there is a very good role also for companies that are represented on this forum.
Yeah, and I should be told off if I don't point out that there is a working group within us that's working on these. Delphine is the point of contact, and I think they're in contact with you in any case. But for everyone out there, if you're a member of ERSC, then there is a working group that's looking at developing the links in this area and engaging with DG Klima and indeed the other stakeholders that Simon has mentioned, in order to try to see where the technology can contribute and what needs to be done to make it contribute better. So just a reminder to everyone there. Okay.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm going to step out and leave you
Go
to
and find a beer. Go on. Thanks,
Okay.
thanks again, Simon.
Yes.
And talk to you next year.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Thanks, Delphine.
Bye.
Thank you very